Thank you again for joining us both in person and virtually for creators who helped cast and creations that helped shape Kentucky's Quilt Mystique. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I would like to remind those of us joining in person to please silence your cell phones for the duration of the program. It's going to get somebody. Don't let it be you. Linda Elisabeth LaPinta earned her BA in English Literature, English Composition, and Oral History from Beloit College, her MA in Journalism from Syracuse University's S.I. Newhouse School of Public Communications, her MAT in English from the University of Louisville, and her doctoral degree in Leadership from Spalding University. After working in oral history, social service, and editing positions, LaPinta served as a tenured professor of English and journalism at Elizabethtown Community College and Midway College, prior to assuming successive roles as chair of the Adult Accelerated Program and director of the doctoral program in leadership at Spalding. Under her maiden name, Beatty, she published 4 previous books with the University Press of Kentucky. Departing slightly from our usual procedure tonight, there will not be a formal Q&A session for this lecture. In-person attendees are welcome to ask questions at the book table. Please join me in welcoming Linda.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and thank you all for being here. I see so many familiar and friendly faces in the audience, and I appreciate your coming tonight. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you this evening about Kentucky's stunning reputation, not only nationally, but worldwide, as a state that has long held a respected and even exalted reputation as a forerunner in the quilt world. Some years ago, when a University Press of Kentucky acquisitions editor asked me to write a comprehensive book about Kentucky quilts, I replied, surely that's been done. Indeed, I soon learned 2 fine historical books had been published: Mary Washington Clark's Kentucky Quilts and Their Makers, and John Finley and Jonathan Holstein's Kentucky Quilts, 1800 to 1900. However, the focus of Clark's volume is traditional quilt makers in the western part of the Commonwealth, and as the title of Finley and Holstein's book suggests, the subjects of their books precede the 20th, much less the 21st century. A comprehensive state quilt book had yet to be written, a fact I found increasingly peculiar as I began learning about the numerous ways in which Kentucky's quilt world trailblazing set the standard for practices in other states and nations. And so I said yes to writing what became Kentucky Quilts and Quiltmakers, 3 centuries of creativity, community, and commerce. I am not a quilt maker. I'm a writer. My book is not about quilt patterns, although I name a few, nor is my book about how to make quilts, although several contemporary quilt makers offer tips in my book regarding how to master their signature techniques. My passion for this project focuses on the astonishing breadth and depth of Commonwealth quilt history and quilt art, on the creative hands and minds of breathtakingly original quilt makers, and on the quilt historians, experts, and entrepreneurs who introduced taking stock in the quilts in the state, launching landmark quilt exhibitions, and establishing the National Quilt Museum and the American Quilters Society. What's more, my interest in recognizing the ways in which the art of numerous prominent contemporary quilt makers has evolved, and in hearing how they have impacted and continue to influence and encourage each other, led me to include in my book interviews I conducted with Kentucky quilt makers. Kentucky Quilts and Quiltmakers focuses on quilt art created for walls as well as for beds, on quilt art stitched by hand as well as by machine, and on famous as well as infamous quilt makers, quilt world influencers, quilt world organizations, and more. Indeed, the last word in my text is the word more, as the province of quilts constitutes realms of art, community, and commerce, with quilt-related sales of all sorts projected to be a $5 billion annual business in the United States by 2025. In addition, since new quilt makers arrive on the scene daily, just as significant antique quilts continue to emerge from trunks stored in attics, The social history I have written will require the same updates required of all social histories as new discoveries and information emerge. This evening, I plan to introduce you to a sampling of the stories that I hope help illustrate Kentucky's seminal quilt world contributions. Several decades prior to 1792, the year in which Kentucky achieved statehood, Virginians, North Carolinians, and others seeking to settle in the West brought the first quilts into what would become our commonwealth. Soon thereafter, though, in the late 18th through the mid-19th century, numerous Kentuckians, primarily women, purportedly a few men, and no doubt some enslaved workers, made some of the most stunning quilts in the nation. Several existing Kentucky-made whitework quilts, there's one there, hail from that era. Cotton or linen, glazed chintz or glazed wool, plain or printed calicos, all were used to make whole cloth quilts, so named because such quilts are created from a single piece of fabric instead of from segments of fabric stitched together. Particularly popular in Kentucky were plain white, ivory, or ecru-colored cotton, linen, or wool fabric quilts distinguished by elaborate quilting that created stuffed design motifs such as flowers raised in relief. Often reserved for celebratory occasions such as marriages, whitework quilts consisted of white cloth padded with sufficient cotton batting to shape high relief motifs and cutwork applique quilts in intricate vine-like patterns. In 1856, Virginia Mason Ivy, born in Tennessee and raised in Keysburg, Logan County, Kentucky, created a stunning whitework quilt, which you see here. Perhaps the nation's best known example of a whitework quilt, it is a star in the textile collection of the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. Ivy's quilt bears the inscription 1856, a representation of the fairground near Russellville, Kentucky. And the Smithsonian's description of the quilt notes the intricacy of Ivy's quilt top design, in which she attempted to capture every building, animal, and fairgoer she witnessed. With thousands of fine stitches, Ivy joined 2 layers of high-quality cotton, the cradle cotton fiber batting. Her technique achieved a sculpted effect further softened by its 4-sided frame of cotton fringe. In my book, I describe some of the state's finest whitework quilts, just as I highlight in my discussion of Kentucky native Laurel Horton's text, Whitework, Women Stitching Identity, her emphasis on the political, social, and racial subtext of whitework quilts. 2 of our nation's best known and most curious antique quilts reside in Kentucky. Memory and mourning quilts came into vogue in the 19th century. The former were designed in remembrance of people or events of importance to the quilt maker, and the latter were fashioned as commemorative tributes to deceased family members, friends, and even political leaders or military heroes. Elisabeth Roseberry Mitchell created the nation's most famous memorial quilt. Pennsylvania native Mitchell moved first to Ohio and then to Kentucky, where she finished designing and stitching her famous Kentucky graveyard quilt and her lesser-known practice quilt top, a forerunner of the Kentucky graveyard quilt. After her death, her daughters Sarah and Elisabeth completed both projects, the applique and piece cotton quilt top, which is now in the collection of Kentucky's Highlands Museum and Discovery Center in Ashland, Kentucky, and the Kentucky graveyard quilt, which since 1959 has been a centerpiece in the Kentucky Historical Society's quilt collection. Elisabeth began designing and creating her quilt top, the unfinished practice top, in Ohio in 1836, when her 2-year-old son, John Vanetta Mitchell, passed away. In April 1840, Elisabeth and her husband Shadrach and their 8 youngest surviving children relocated to Quick's Run in Lewis County, Kentucky, where the sometimes storekeeper, tavern owner, and farmer had purchased a new plot of land on soil that promised to be more fertile than the rocky Pennsylvania and Ohio terrains the family left behind. At first, their new land produced lavishly, but extended droughts soon caused crops to fail and debts to mount. In January 1843, Elisabeth and Shadrach's son, Matthias, better known as Bub, who had remained in Ohio, died at age 19 of causes unknown today. His parents returned to Ohio to visit his grave, and that same year, Elisabeth began work on her Kentucky graveyard quilt. The quilt depicts her deceased son's coffins at the rear of the graveyard, with additional coffins for herself, her husband, and their surviving children, basted outside the graveyard gate. As each immediate family member passed away, Elisabeth's plan was to move one of the coffins from outside the Applegate Cemetery into the graveyard proper to join those relatives who had crossed to the other side. When Elisabeth herself died on January 22nd, 1857, at age 58, hers would be the third coffin on the edge of the quilt to reach its final resting place. This is probably the most famous Kentucky-made quilt in existence. Kentuckians' reputation for creating numerous popular 19th century quilt types and patterns, such as medallion, Rose of Sharon, and New York beauty quilts, a pattern also known as Rocky Mountain Road and Crown of Thorns, among other names, is legion. But our fast forwarding to the fervor for crazy quilts that proliferated nationwide from the 1870s to century's end showcases spectacular examples of their type. It would be difficult to overstate the popularity of late 19th and early 20th century crazy quilts, named for the jumbled, whimsical audacity of their Asian-influenced designs and for the typically delightful and occasionally unexpected elements of their ornament and fabric. Rarely conceived as bedside quilts, these dark jewel-tone precursors of late 20th and early 21st century studio art quilts are witty remembrances and visual memoirs rendered from silk, satin, cotton, and/or wool, embellished with cigar bands, commemorative ribbons, needlepoint portraits, floral applique, charms, and almost anything else. Indeed, crazy quilts showcase Victorian women's embroidery skills in an era marked by royal deaths in Britain and France, as well as by the explosive joie de vivre of a nation eager to herald a new age filled with advances in technology and communication. The content and composition of crazy quilts wed the Western world's contradictory concerns. The 1862 International Exhibition in London introduced Europe and the Americas to Japonism, the minimalist, asymmetrical aesthetic that countered the Western love of visual balance and that highlighted the use of everyday objects as decorative motifs. Most surviving examples of 19th century crazy quilts are in fragile condition because they are made of delicate fabrics. Perhaps the best known crazy quilt belonging to the Filson Historical Society is a 25-panel red and blue bordered quilt embroidered with images of flowers, a swan, cotton, butterflies, and a high-heeled shoe, all surrounding a peacock in the center square. Ella Bowling Humphrey, the great-granddaughter of Louisville founder George Roger Clark's older brother, Jonathan, designed and assembled the quilt in Russellville in Logan County in 1887. And Russellville is the same place where the woman who did the whitework quilt lived. Lyda Fennell Allen's Star Quilt Throw, another crazy quilt. Her throw is in the collection of the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. It is a particularly painterly and refined example of a crazy quilt that stands out for the controlled complexity of its design. Allen of Harrodsburg, Kentucky, made the quilt in 1899. She learned needlework skills while attending Daughters College, now the Beaumont Inn, in her hometown. See, one to the other. Allen framed the 82 patches of her silk, cotton, and wool quilt throw with an 8-pointed star created from black silk pile and centered with a swan. She lined her throw with red wool embroidered with daisies. Kentucky Quilts and Quiltmakers addresses national and international discoveries and enthusiasms, as well as politics, conflicts, and inventions that affected quilt patterns and tastes in Kentucky and across the nation in the first quarter of the 21st century. However, here we will fast forward to focus on the 1930s, a decade that brought much attention to Kentucky-made quilts. Although quilt makers created too many nationally significant 20th century quilts to list, much less discuss here, it is vital to stress the importance of the Bond quilt making legacy that spans 2 generations and introduced a modernity in pattern design that continues to influence contemporary quilt artists. Of particular interest to the discussion of Black Americans in quilt making in 19th century Kentucky is the story of civil rights movement leader Julian Bond's great-grandmother, Jane Bond, an enslaved woman who lived in what is now Bell County, Kentucky. Also of interest in terms of her impact on the quilt world is Louisville-born Ruth Clement Bond, who died in 2005 at age 101. The wife of Jane's grandson, Max, Ruth became one of the nation's premier quilt designers. Her prominent parents, George and Emma Clement, served respectively as a bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church and as the first Black woman to be named American Mother of the Year. Ruth, who earned her bachelor's and master's degrees in English literature at Northwestern University prior to serving as chair of the English department of Kentucky State College, which is now Kentucky State University, married J. Max Bond Sr. in 1931 and accompanied him to the West Coast, where he earned his doctoral degree before the couple moved to Northern Alabama, where from 1934 to 1938, Max worked as the training supervisor for the Tennessee Valley Authority, Wheeler Dam construction workers, and where Ruth took it upon himself to institute a home improvement project for the workers' wives. In conjunction with her effort, she created quilt patterns for the wives who, in turn, taught Ruth to quilt. Ruth's endeavors assisted the women with whom she worked, but she also created extraordinary modern designs for pictorial quilts that emphasized Black Americans' enhanced New Deal opportunities. These creations, jaw-dropping art, simultaneously expanded discussions of social justice and equity and extended concepts relating to quilt design. Of the 6 large quilts the women made in 1934, 3 survived, along with the smaller sample quilts. Black Power and Lazy Man remain the most reproduced TVA quilts. That one's the one called Lazy Man. As she did with all quilts, Ruth cut the patterns from paper and selected the fabric colors. The workers' wives performed the quilting. Lazy Man, quilted by Rosa Marie Thomas, was voted one of the 100 best quilts of the 20th century and now resides in the Michigan State University Museum. The energetic Matisse-like Black figure that dominates the quilt against a background of palms and a setting sun is also caught between an abstract profile of a woman's body and an extended white hand. The man in the middle appears to be choosing between indulgence or even indigence and government-granted security. As we know, the relatively prosperous decade of the 1920s ended in the onslaught of the Great Depression, which quilt historian Mary Kay Waldvogel indicates drained what little prosperity was left in the state. Companies and factories were shuttered permanently, and farmers' income dropped by 50%. She cites the 1930 federal census, which estimated that there were 29,000 jobless Kentuckians seeking employment, a number that rose to 42,000 just 2 years later. On top of that, natural disasters in the Commonwealth bookended the Depression, which wreaked even greater economic havoc. A drought in 1930 preceded the state's storied 1937 flood that devastated communities throughout the Commonwealth to the tune of an estimated $250 million. The scarcity of funds available to most Kentucky women during the Depression encouraged them to seek artistic expression in quilting, an activity, states Waldvogel, that could simultaneously fulfill creative impulses for self-expression and yield something practical for the family. 2 utterly dissimilar Depression-era quilts illustrate a range of creative Kentucky quilt styles that differed from the Dresden plate and grandmother's flower garden patterns popular in the 3rd decade of the 20th century. Between 1933 and 1934, during the Depression, when it was common to create quilts from thousands of pieces of fabric, George A. Yarrell fashioned the Spectrum quilt, now in the collection of the Kentucky Museum at Western Kentucky University. Registrar and collection curator Sandra Stabell estimates that Yarrell's quilt, a variation of the postage stamp quilt pattern, includes 66,000 quarter-inch or slightly larger diamond-shaped pieces, images of which textbook publishers have borrowed to illustrate geometry lessons. She notes that the quiltmaker, an immigrant from New Zealand, worked as an engraver for Bowling Green's Morris Jewelers. Newspapers used to run stories about quilts made of tens of thousands of pieces of fabrics, Stabell states. It was kind of like a nuclear arms race to see who could make a quilt with the most pieces. Another celebrated 1930s Kentucky quilt that now resides in the Kentucky Museum, the Godey quilt, was created by Bowling Green native Mildred Potter Lissauer, who lived most of her life in Louisville. Stabell says of Lissauer, she was quite an interesting person, rather eccentric. One day, according to her son, she saw a quilt titled Flower Baskets, probably made by her aunt. Upon seeing that quilt, Lissauer said, "I can do better than that." So she started to make the Godey quilt. At the time, Vogue magazine was running a series of articles that included reproductions of vintage dress patterns. She clipped those articles and similar patterns from other print media, as well as from greeting cards. Then Lissauer began making appliques, but not every applique made the cut. Thank you. She ended up stitching those she liked on beautiful foundation fabric of champagne-colored silk satin. As the March 10th, 1939 edition of Louisville's Courier Journal notes, Lissauer entered her Godey quilt, valued at $5,000, in numerous quilt shows. The article states, "It has never been exhibited without winning a prize." Some quilt makers, star among them was Kentucky's much revered Eleanor Beard, who rocketed onto the national scene to join the handful of powerful and accomplished quilt world entrepreneurs represented early in the 20th century. She founded the most prestigious quilt brand in the nation, Eleanor Beard Studios. As a child, Eleanor Robertson moved with her family to Louisville. In 1917, she married Marvin Beard, the proprietor of her general store in Hardinsburg. On occasion, Marvin allowed local cash-strapped farmers to barter for goods, which is how he acquired and accumulated the sheep's wool, from which Eleanor decided to create batting for what would become her signature whole cloth trapunto style satin, sateen, and satin-like quilts. At first, in 1923, Eleanor's original solid color, double bed size, hand-stitched quilts with their trademark scalloped edges were devoid of patchwork or applique and sold for $17.50, which would be about $300 today. 2 decades later, the businesswoman would design a mid-century chintz applique album quilt, and she modernized applique quilts to order. A beauty acquired in 1971 for the American wing of New York's Metropolitan Museum is an outstanding example of an Eleanor Beard album quilt constructed from quilt blocks appliqued with floral motifs, some cut from antique chintz and some with new 1940 fabric, the year in which she, or more probably her most expert employees, made the quilt. Beard's appreciation of elegant fabric, painstakingly and elaborately quilted, became legendary and encouraged her to extend her art into a commercial concern she first called Hedgeland Studio. Whether Beard herself quilted, as well as designed quilts, as some historians suggest, remains in question. However, her granddaughter, Susan Castleman Clare of Louisville, insists that although Beard was a brilliant businesswoman, she could no more quilt than thread a needle. Beard later renamed her company Beard Studios, and her business underwent other iterations as her company grew. In addition to advertising her upscale quilts and related merchandise, such as sophisticated pajamas and robes for women, Beard's establishment sent sales representatives to the country's premier department stores, even as she also opened her own boutiques in high-end retail markets nationwide. To build her brand, Beard encouraged stores that carried her merchandise in Chicago, Manhattan, and other big cities to regard the Beard aura as more than bed coverings and boudoir loungewear. Indeed, to consider her boutiques to be lifestyle coteries in which elite shoppers could mingle with like-minded arbiters of taste. Even as Beard and her family moved from Hardinsburg to Louisville, the entrepreneur's Central Kentucky workforce grew as her vision and business expanded. In addition to her sales via brick and mortar venues, she accumulated more profits by outfitting staterooms of cruise ships and selling couture quilts, as well as bedroom and loungewear accoutrements to well-heeled women, among them Hollywood stars. At the height of her brand's popularity, she employed as many as 1,000 seamstresses, most of whom lived in or near Hardinsburg, to stitch the quilts she designed. Beard transformed her Hardinsburg studio into the New York corporation American Needlecrafts Incorporated, with its main office in Manhattan and its 4 satellite studios, each with its own production specialty, in the Kentucky cities of Elisabethtown, Hardinsburg, Greensburg, and Columbia. Today, Beard, who died in 1951, continues to be recognized for producing first-class quilts and for pioneering her brand as a luxury lifestyle. Indeed, she led the way for such late 20th and early 21st century designers and entrepreneurs as Ralph Lauren and Martha Stewart. During the first decades of the 20th century, as rail service expanded and postal delivery extended to rural areas, manufacturing and marketing worked hand in hand to produce and promote the sought-after standardized goods customers craved. Cottage industries sprang up, especially in the Midwest and Upper South, following their earlier 19th century launch in the Southern Highlands of Appalachia. Home-based manufacturing permitted people to work from their cottages and to get paid by the piece. This low overhead business model, adopted by such entrepreneurs as Eleanor Beard, tended to benefit a company's entrepreneurial owner more than her comparatively low-paid laborers. However, the mass production of quilts provided quilt makers, many of them women who had never worked outside the home, occasion to earn money of their own. The arts and crafts, Art Nouveau, and Art Deco movements spanned the late 19th century through the 1930s. In some ways, these movements coexisted with, and in some ways they countered, the commercialism and standardization encouraged by the machine age. In 1931, Mrs. J.K. Stoddard, the spouse of the physician who served the people of Wooten in Leslie County, Kentucky, assembled area women to replicate colonial pattern quilts, which were all the rage in the 1920s and early 1930s for a national market. The mountain cabin quilters, as Stoddard called her cottage industry, often had to trek 10 miles to secure instructions for each quilt prior to stitching their allotted bed coverings at home. Most of the women of Wooten were involved in the business. Those who could not sew the finest stitches carded cotton and wool for quilt batting. In 1935, Wooten was still the manufacturing site of mountain cabin quilters that accorded a constructive communal sense to the work that women often performed together, especially during summer quiltings or quilting bees. Social gatherings where women completed collective quilt projects. A rare feature of the quilts created by mountain cabin quilters is that they regularly fabricated their batting from the plants they grew in their gardens and the sheep they raised on their land. The enterprise's founder, Mrs. J.K. Stoddard, known locally as Doc's Woman, wrote, "Wooten lies in a gap, and in every direction the Appalachians surround it, and to the top they are covered with trees through which are scattered the cabins of the mountain people. In the making of a quilt, there are several serious considerations. The piecing means perfect shapes and corners and exact shaping of the pattern. The quilting is exact too, and just as good on the wrong side as it is on the right." This is in her words. "It takes from 10 days to 6 weeks to do the quilting alone, and all the time it is in the making, it must be kept spotlessly clean. The coloring is selected by the manager, and all the work must pass her censorship and that of the committee consisting of 4 mountain women. When the quilts are made, the proceeds go to manifold purposes. One old woman is saving for a set of teeth. Another is buying herself a home after years of staying around. Another, who herself can neither read nor write, is helping to put her boy through school. Another now has a pump in her kitchen, so she need no longer carry water from the branch. In the same era, quilt contests proliferated, and the nationwide competition that remains the most memorable featured Lexingtonian Margaret Caden, who entered a quilt in the Sears National Quilt Contest in the 1933 World's Fair in Chicago. My book tells the story of how Caden's prize-winning quilt caused quilt makers across the nation to admire Kentuckians' fine workmanship, just as it relates the scandal that ensued when the truth came out that 3 Kentuckians employed by Caden created the quilt for which Caden took credit. Also significant to the story of the Sears National Quilt Contest is that 6 of the 30 finalists were Kentuckians. The greatest number of finalists from any other state was 2. The late historian and quilt scholar Questa Benberry employed the word legendary to describe the Commonwealth's quilt makers and quilters, and even suggested the existence of a Kentucky Quiltmakers mystique to explain why, in the 1930s, people across the country considered them to be among the best, if not the best, in the nation. A mid-20th century Kentucky treasure in the quilt-making realm was Velma Kahn, who grew up in Monticello in southeastern Kentucky on the same farm she later shared with her husband, Elmer. She learned to quilt from her mother, Louise Southwood, who learned from her mother, Alice Young Haynes, who learned from Kahn's great-grandmother, Ganem Young. It was Ganem who initiated the intricate freehand quilt top designs her descendants mastered. But in 1983, it was Kahn, then 71, whom the Wayne County Outlook, her hometown newspaper, cited as the Queen of Quilts. Her unique talent involved drawing freehand feather and plume-like emblems on permanent pressed bed sheets to create easy-to-maintain quilt tops. Those privileged to have witnessed Kahn's process marveled at her skill. After folding and ironing a bed sheet into squares to locate the sheet's center, she stretched a string from that nexus to create the circumference of her middle design, which she would then fill with freehand pencil drawings of the aforementioned plumes, as well as with flowers and geometric shapes. Kahn's monochromatic quilts emphasized her intricate designs and hand stitching. She created pastel as well as white quilts, depending on the color of the sheet she purchased. The high demand for the Queen of Quilts creations enabled her to sell her design work to customers who would quilt her patterns. If a customer wanted a pieced or applique quilt top, Kahn sewed the pieces together prior to penciling her design. Kahn's mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother planted cotton on their family farm to produce their own batting. But Kahn, who hand-stitched her quilts, drew the line at picking and combing cotton. In the 1950s and 1960s, as the Velma Kahns of Kentucky and elsewhere continued to fashion show quilts treasured by their relatives and communities, popular culture trailblazers began to encourage change. The Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 generated interstate highways that transformed road travel for business and pleasure and overhauled interstate commerce as freight trucks and airplanes began to co-opt boats and train transportation. Suburban living attracted the expanding post-World War II middle class, as did demand by consumers for continuity of quality and experience. Hotel chains such as Holiday Inn Hotels and fast food franchises such as Kentucky Fried Chicken offered consistently appointed rooms and identically prepared and priced meals to travelers eager to engage in foreseeable experiences. Families who traveled from the East Coast to the West Coast and everywhere in between depended on encountering familiar accommodations along the way. They came to view uniformity as reliability and reliability as progress. And, as had been the case 40 years earlier, increasing numbers of housewives selected modern, mass-produced, store-bought bedspreads over quilts they had come to view as outdated. However, 2 mid and late 20th century national quilt revivals and landmark quilt shows, ignited in part by Kentuckians, resulted in several Kentucky quilt makers coming to be recognized as being the foremost being among the foremost 100 quilt makers in the nation, while winning the quilt world's most prestigious prizes and honors. In 1969, a landmark exhibition, Objects USA, 1969, opened at the Smithsonian American Art Museum in Washington, D.C., and later traveled to 22 additional museums in the United States, as well as to sites in Europe. Kentucky's connection to Objects USA centers on fiber artist Alma Wallace Lesh, a native of Kevel in McCracken County, who was born in 1917 and who lived most of her life in Shepherdsville in Bullitt County until her death in 1999. Her fresh, original perspectives on her subjects and on the nature and purpose of textile composition itself caused other artists and critics to gasp at her creations and reconstruct in their minds and work the boundaries of quilt's possibilities. Lesh's Objects USA entry, Bathsheba's Bedspread, is a thickly textured, appliqued, and stitched abstraction in pink, cranberry, umber, purple, gold, and olive. Now in the collection of New York's Museum of Arts and Design, the pattern suggests, without fully articulating, representational forms. Two Kentucky artists who saw it at the 1969 exhibition found Lesh's painterly, non-traditional quilt to be unlike any they had ever seen. Those awed attendees, Jane Birch Cochran of Rabbit Hash and Arturo Alonso Sandoval of Lexington, would soon be counted among the world's best-known art quilt makers. Lesh's fiber portraits blend such found objects as buttons, ribbons, lace, gloves, embroidery, and quilted clothing into collages that represent women's garments. The artwork's absence of faces and limbs permit viewers to superimpose on her creation their own imagined subjects. Lesh received numerous titles and recognitions for her artistic achievements, including the Kentucky Governor's Award for Lifetime Contribution to Visual Arts. In 1971, another landmark quilt exhibition, Abstract Design in American Quilts, altered quilt makers as well as the public's perception of quilts. In 1967, entrepreneur Jonathan Holstein met Gail Vanderhoof, a kindred spirit with extensive art, textile, merchandising, and advertising experience. The couple made a home in New York City, from which they took weekend excursions to visit friends in neighboring states. During their travels, they engaged in frequent antiquing forays in Pennsylvania, where they found pristine quilts of bold and striking design. The twosomes avocation became their vocation as they purchased and learned more and more. They soon realized that the quilt sellers with whom they dealt regarded their textile inventories merely as merchandise to move. Yet in the 19th and 20th century quilt treasures they turned up, Vanderhoof and Holstein encountered patterns and colors as stunning and archetypal as any produced by abstract painters. As their passion for quilt art grew, and as they realized how unappreciated their finds were, they became determined to share their perspective. On July 1st, 1971, Abstract Design in American Quilts, a collection of 60 antique and a few Amish quilts curated by Holstein and Vanderhoof, opened to an awed audience at Manhattan's Whitney Museum of American Art. Before 1971, a few museums had showcased the occasional quilt, but prior to the Whitney exhibit, no premier art museum had endorsed quilts as exemplary top-tier art. Holstein and Vanderhoof's exhibition disrupted the definition of quilts, even as it illuminated the interpretation of art. In 1979, Ohio native Nancy Crow, an early and much lauded art quilt innovator and co-founder of the Dairy Barn Cultural Arts Center in Athens, Ohio. The purpose of the center, which continues to thrive today, has come to include teaching new quilting, dyeing, and piecing techniques. The founder's first major effort was to stage a significant art quilt show that would become, and arguably remains, the premier biennial art exhibition in the nation. Among Kentucky-affiliated quilt makers who have won quilt national prizes are Northern Kentucky native Terry Hancock Mangat, longtime Lexingtonian Arturo Alonso Sandoval in 1993 and 2019, Louisvillian Kathleen Loomis, and former Paducah resident Carol Bryart Gentry. With such original textiles artists as Alma Lesh emerging in Kentucky and elsewhere, starting to share their ideas and show their work in the 1950s, gaining ground in the 1960s, and exploding onto the art scene in the 1970s, and with the advent of a juried biennial exhibition of contemporary quilt art like Quilt National, it is impossible to pinpoint just when a new form of quilts, known as art quilts or studio art quilts, shed their experimental status to become staples of the quilt world. However, in 1986, San Francisco quilt dealer Michael Kyle, co-founder of the Quilt Digest, and Ohio-based quilt scholar and writer Penny McMorris, curated a show of the work of 16 quilt innovators at the Los Angeles Municipal Art Gallery. The book was titled The Art Quilt, or the exhibit was. Among the artists showcased were Quilt National co-founder Nancy Crow and Kentuckian Terry Hancock Mangett. As Kyle and McMorris searched for a title for their exhibition, they coined the term art quilt, after which they named their seminal show. Like traditional quilts, art quilts range in size and design, and although some may be made as bed covers, most are not. As with crazy quilts, with which they share a resemblance, art quilts can be embellished and may consist of diverse fabrics and other materials. Some quilt makers incorporate paint, found in decorative objects, and other non-traditional media to create this art designed more for display on walls than on beds. Why call art quilts quilts? Some traditional quilt makers may question the use of the term to describe creations that differ so greatly from those stitched from time-honored patterns. But the definition of a quilt, 3 layers stitched together, accurately describes traditional quilts and art quilts, both of which may be wholly or partially quilted. The descriptor art does not constitute a value judgment of a quilt's aesthetic or creative merit. Rather, it serves to distinguish a type of quilt. Traditional quilts and art quilts are both categories of art. As Robert Shaw points out in his 1997 book, The Art Quilt, the exhibit defined the cutting edge of the new movement and identified its leading practitioners, among them Mangett, who gained fame for initiating the embellishment movement in quilts. Shaw also cites the previously discussed Cochran and Sandoval, as well as the late Lenore Davis of Newport, Kentucky, prominent art quilt pioneers. He identifies Mangett and Cochran as 2 of the nation's direct inheritors of the influence of the crazies. Their lavishly embellished artworks resemble Victorian crazy quilts in both intention and unrestricted creative exuberance. Terry Hancock Mangett was born and raised in Covington, Kentucky, near Cincinnati. Although she graduated from the University of Kentucky with a degree in art in 1970, she claims her love of patterned cloth developed not from her art professors, who insisted she favor fiber over paint, but from her own experimentation with textiles that began at age 5. Mangett's subjects, like Cochran's, extend from personal experience to social and political commentary. Peculiar to Mangett's work are the religious symbols she juxtaposes with pop art idols of contemporary culture in her longtime attempt to make peace with the tenets of her faith. Mangett also tempers serious matters with her tongue-in-cheek humor, thereby affording her biographical subject matter broad appeal. Her shows, awards, and teaching credits over the past 50 years increase in number annually, making her significance in the quilt world clear. In 2000, her Dashboard Saints, in memory of St. Christopher, who lost his magnetism, I love that one, was recognized as one of the 20th century's premier 100 quilts. Her work is also included in Martha Seelman's first volume of Masters Art Quilts, major work by leading artists, published in 2008. The book, with representative creations from 40 master art quilt makers, also includes work by Cochran and Bryart Gentry. Although she has lived in Taos, New Mexico in recent years, Mangett's art remained rooted in Kentucky. Jane Birch Cochran's quilts suggest stories or memorialize people or events, but they always, in the manner of Alma Lesh's portraits, permit viewers to superimpose their own meanings onto her art. Many of Cochrane's quilts, especially those created as remembrances of her mother, include one of her mother's gloves clasping a material hand, or two gloves conjoined in the shape of a cross, sometimes topped with a lily, or backed with a halo-shaped arch. Her 1989 quilt, Ring Around the Roses, Ring Around the Moon, is in the Smithsonian American Art Museum's permanent collection. In 2002, Japan's Tokyo International Great Quilt Festival named Cochrane one of 30 distinguished quilt artists of the world. She was also included, along with former Kentuckians Carol Bryart Fowler Gentry, Valerie White, and Juanita Yeager, in 500 art quilts, an inspiring collection of contemporary work. A constant figure in Cochrane's early 21st century work is the silhouette of her Labrador Retriever Jr., who served as mayor of Rabbit Hash from 2004 to 2008. And this is true. From the launch of these exhibitions and the emergence of a broader definition of quilts than had previously existed, the quilt realm expanded exponentially, with Kentucky at its apex. A quilt expert, appraiser, collector, and influencer at the heart of the matter was Shelley Ziegert, third row, accompanied by oh, well, you hear too much. She's accompanied by her friend and quilt collector Eleanor Bingham Miller. Who's Eleanor? There's Eleanor. Yay! Their energy and foresight launched the Kentucky Quilt Project Incorporated, the nation's first statewide quilt project. A few short years after Pennsylvania native Shelley Weiss married Kenny Ziegert in 1962 and moved with him to his hometown Louisville, her energy, intellectual curiosity, and drive, coupled with a serendipitous encounter with a quilt dealer to the stars, created her pathway to becoming Kentucky's premier quilt expert. Certainly, accepting an invitation to a small in-home gathering to meet a young quilt dealer from Louisville would prove life-changing. Bruce Mann, who had been featured in People magazine, sold quilts, which had become popular commodities with celebrities since the Whitney exhibit. Ziegert recalls being mesmerized by the magnificent quilt collection Mann displayed on that magical evening. Immediately, she recognized quilts as the art she would buy, yet her fascination with the fabulous textiles transcended transactional interests. For Ziegert, quilts would prove transformational. The following morning, after a sleepless night, she called and asked him to meet with her. When he did, she brokered a deal. Mann regularly purchased quilts in Kentucky to sell to wealthy collectors on the East and West Coasts, yet he yearned to acquire a Kentucky clientele. Ziegert, a veteran networker, craved learning all she could about quilts, so she promised to connect Mann with prospective clients if he would teach her about the quilt trade. Soon, Ziegert hosted parties for Mann and introduced him to her friends, among them Phyllis George Brown, the former Miss America and sportscaster of the CBS Sports pre-show, The NFL Today. Brown, like Ziegert and Mann, would become a major quilt world influencer. One day, after Ziegert had come to know Mann well, she encountered him at an antique show. He told her how much he wanted to purchase a particular quilt he thought he could resell at a much higher price. When he added that he did not have the money, she offered to buy the quilt and split the profit with him after he sold it. But Mann never had the chance to make good on this deal. On a trip to California to sell quilts in November 1980, he died in an automobile accident. Folded in his van was the quilt Ziegert had funded. Shortly thereafter, Eleanor Bingham Miller, the youngest daughter of famed Louisville Courier Journal editor Barry Bingham Sr., paid Ziegert a visit. Bingham Miller had also been a close friend of Mann's after having been introduced to him by Ziegert. Bingham Miller confided Mann's proposal to study Kentucky quilts and curate a quilt exhibition, and the two women sat at Ziegert's kitchen table to debate the plan's merits. Ziegert was enthusiastic about Mann's scheme, but felt that his vision had stopped short of grand. As the friends' conversation continued, the concept of staging an exhibition grew increasingly ambitious until they produced a detailed blueprint of what would become the Kentucky Quilt Project Incorporated. The first and primary purpose of the project would be to survey Kentucky quilts to discover where they were and what they were in terms of their ages, patterns, and textile composition. No other state had undertaken so extensive a quilt documentation endeavor. Kentucky would be the first. Two additional components of the three-part proposal: a statewide exhibition of the best of the Quilt Days quilts, and a book to document both the Quilt Days and the exhibition, would follow. Louisville area entrepreneur Eunice Ray accepted the invitation to be the first team member to join Ziegert and Bingham Miller, and she served as the third author of the Kentucky Quilt Project Incorporated proposal. Ray knew little about quilts, but as a marketing mastermind, she thrived on selling the project's concept. In fact, it was Ray who concocted the notion of staging Quilt Days. Resolved to organize the most professional project possible, Ziegert, Bingham Miller, and Ray knew that in addition to a few volunteers, they needed funds for all the elements of designing and executing their project-related efforts. Bingham Miller recalls, "I went to my family to ask for support, hat in hand. I remember my mother saying, 'Well, I don't know what your grandmother would think about our sponsoring something she would consider useful sewing.' I replied, 'Well, grandmother isn't around, so please write the check anyway.'" By writing that check, Bingham Miller's parents, Barry Bingham Sr. and his wife Mary, provided the original capital. Then Bingham Miller began raising funds. Today, she says, the grant money we needed would be considered trivial, but at the time we faced an absolutely closed-door situation. No one could dream of a reason why they should give money at the corporate level or even at the personal level to, as people scoffed, take bedspreads and make a book about them or put them on a wall. What we wanted to do just didn't compute with folks. Yet Bingham Miller's persistence paid off, and among project contributors were the state's premier businesses and arts organizations. When Bingham Miller met half the fundraising goal, Humana Incorporated founder Wendell Cherry pledged that Humana would match any additional dollars raised. "We were very lucky," Bingham Miller comments, "that Wendell Cherry completely understood from the beginning that quilts are art." In my book, I discuss how the Kentucky Quilt Project directors hosted 12 quilt days throughout the Commonwealth from August 1981 to March 1982, just as I detail what their endeavors turned up as women, as well as a few men, throughout the state traveled to one of 10 cities to have their quilts documented and photographed. At the same time, former high school business director Dorothy West soon joined the directors as project coordinator, and Louisville civic leader Katie Christopherson was named project advisor. The second phase of the Kentucky Quilt Project, Inc. called for producing the most comprehensive quilt exhibition to date in Kentucky history. In 1983, project directors requested the loan of 44 of the most striking quilts they surveyed during Quilt Days to display at their Kentucky Science Center exhibit, Kentucky Quilts 1800 to 1900, a show that for 2 years thereafter traveled to 12 museums throughout the country with the Smithsonian Institution Traveling Exhibition Service. According to Ziegert, the museum was packed on opening night. She notes, "I think we had 400 or 500 people from Louisville and out of town. Busloads of Quilt Guild and church members came. And of course, the quilt owners and their families were invited to the exhibition opening, which received rave reviews." In their proposal for the Kentucky Quilt Project, Ziegert and Bingham Miller envisioned that the written document to accompany their quilt exhibition would be a book designed to surpass typical museum show catalogs. As always, the pair did not so much request as engineer what they wanted. The women turned to abstract design and American quilts curator Jonathan Holstein to ask him to write the book's introduction. What he learned about the scope of the Kentucky Quilt Project not only excited him enough to agree to their request, but also intrigued him sufficiently to travel to Kentucky to investigate. Holstein wrote the book's introduction and quilt commentaries, while the project commissioned Louisville Courier-Journal feature writer and freelance journalist John Finley to author the text. For decades, it would serve as the definitive book about the initial efforts of the Kentucky Quilt Project and about 19th century Kentucky quilts. Since the Kentucky Quilt Project began collecting data on more than 1,000 quilts, every other state in the Union has, and additional countries have, conducted quilt surveys modeled after its innovative methods. After 1983, the Kentucky Quilt Project, based on its landmark successes, was more vital than ever, which permitted its directors to branch out to launch additional significant initiatives. By 1990, the Kentucky Quilt Project Inc. directors, then Ziegert, Bingham Miller, and Holstein, decided that honoring the 20-year anniversary of abstract design in American quilts would be an appropriate way to illustrate for new audiences the significance of that exhibit, as well as to highlight subsequent quilt world developments. They recreated the Whitney exhibit at the Louisville Museum of History and Science to familiarize current quilt sphere constituents with the original landmark show. In addition, they organized 5 exhibitions and 4 conferences, edited a publication based on the exhibit, published a book that told the full story of Holstein's trailblazing 1971 exhibition, and produced 6 issues of the Quilt Journal, an international review. Ziegert made history again in 1993 when she co-founded the National Alliance for American Quilts, later the Quilt Alliance, to unite disparate realms of the quilt world so that collectors, scholars, educators, quilt makers, and designers could further common goals. The organization focused on promoting the understanding of the quilt as an important grassroots art form, sharing stories and documentation about quilts with the broad public, and educating Americans about the importance of documenting quilts and quilt makers to preserve their stories. Eunice Ray, co-director of the Kentucky Quilt Project, Inc., joined forces with the Alliance for American Quilts co-founders. M.J. Kinman of Louisville, who emerged as a premier art quilter in the first quarter of the 21st century, served as the Alliance's first executive director. If anyone eclipsed Ziegert's reputation as Kentucky's quilt expert in the last decade of the 20th century, it was Ziegert herself, who in the first quarter of the 21st century has continued to engage in trailblazing projects to keep Kentucky quilts and quilt makers in the news. My book discusses her adventures, including her 1998 Kentucky Quilts Roots and Wings exhibit at the Kentucky Folk Arts Center at Morehead State University, her lectures at Quilt World 98 in Tokyo, the year after Tokyo's Nikon Vogue published her book, American Quilt Collections, Antique Quilt Masterpieces, and her foreword for the catalog produced by the French government for 2 related patchwork quilt exhibitions in France in 2003. Ziegert alone, as well as in conjunction with Bingham Miller, curated additional exhibitions in Kentucky and New York. A particularly significant endeavor for which Ziegert will no doubt be long remembered is her 9-part quilt documentary, Why Quilts Matter, History, Art, and Politics. In the series, which Ziegert narrates, she aims to shed light on the significance of quilts as historical artifacts, as drivers of the economy, as art, as women's material culture, and as objects of scholarly inquiry. In 2014, Ziegert played the instrumental role in arranging for Kentucky artist Judy Chicago and her not-for-profit Through the Flower organization to gift her infamous International Honor Quilt, the companion to Chicago's The Dinner Party Quilt, to the University of Louisville and its Height Art Institute. The Kentucky Heritage Quilt Society made news in 1991 when the National Quilting Association adopted Kentucky's Quilters' Day Out as a national event. The day-long celebration, conceived in 1989 and founded in 1990 by the Kentucky Heritage Quilt Society, was rebranded as National Quilting Day. Held annually on the 3rd Saturday in March, Quilters' Day Out began with local guilds and expanded when in-state guilds joined forces to sponsor day-long gatherings. In 1989, Murray, Kentucky quilt maker Phyllis D. Miller conceived the idea for Quilters' Day Out, and in 1992, Hebron, Kentucky resident Marie Salazar, a KHQS member and past president, as well as then president of the National Quilting Association, designated the 3rd Saturday in March as National Quilting Day, which since then has been celebrated annually throughout the United States and worldwide. In 1984, as interest in and activities surrounding all aspects of quilts and quilt making soared, book publishers Bill and Meredith Schrader founded the American Quilters Society, the umbrella organization that now owns and organizes AQS Quilt Week events, quilt shows that offer the largest cash prizes in the country. AQS also publishes AQ Magazine and On Point newsletter, as well as books about quilt patterns, techniques, and other quilt-related topics. The organization also sponsors the AQS Appraiser Certification Program. The Schraders met with instant success in their goal to grant Quiltmakers national recognition and to establish universal quality standards for quilts and quilt shows. In April 1985, the first AQS quilt show premiered. The event grew rapidly. Annually, attendees from throughout the nation and across the world fill all the hotel rooms and rooms for rent in private homes in a 3-county area and across the Ohio River into surrounding states. In 2021, the Schrader's grandson, Bill Schrader III, and Schrader's colleague, James Mitchell, purchased the Paducah-based company that owns AQS and its holdings. Led by the executive show director, Bonnie K. Browning, herself a quilt maker and certified master quilt judge, AQS hosts Quilt Week events in one city on the East Coast and 3 Midwestern cities every year, including one in Paducah each spring. In 1991, the Schraders also founded the Museum of the American Quilter, the downtown Paducah facility that in 2008, the U.S. Congress renamed the National Quilt Museum of the United States. Since that year, Kentucky has held the honor of being home to the nation's premier museum dedicated to showcasing contemporary quilts and fiber arts at the national level. In 2011, the museum's board of directors tapped business consultant Frank W. Bennett for the role of chief executive officer of the National Quilt Museum. Under this now former chief executive officer's direction, USA Today recognized the museum as having one of the world's top quilt displays, and Southern Living magazine touted the institution as being among the premier 25 museums of all types in the South. In the last decades of the 20th and the 21st centuries, in the first quarter of the 21st century, that is, Kentuckians have continued to occupy prominent and preeminent quilt world positions. In the late 1960s, Bill and Josephine Richardson relocated from New Haven, Connecticut to make Whitesburg, Kentucky their home. There they founded Apple Shop, a media, arts, and education center focused on preserving Appalachian arts and crafts. And in Whitesburg, Josephine also opened and ran the Cozy Corner, which until well into the second decade of the 21st century served as the foremost outlet for Eastern Kentucky quilt makers to market their art. In the 1980s, Kentucky's First Lady, Phyllis George Brown, grew so enamored of the Kentucky-made quilts and crafts she encountered while crisscrossing the Commonwealth during her husband's gubernatorial campaign that she convinced the powers that be at New York City's renowned Bloomingdale's department store to open an in-store boutique called Oh Kentucky. That store within a store proved an overnight success, with antique and contemporary hand-stitched Kentucky quilts selling out weekly. Shining a light on Commonwealth Quiltmakers' extraordinary talents served the state well, albeit at what became unsustainable costs. Quite a few contemporary Kentucky or former Kentucky quilt entrepreneurs, among them Karen Witt, Kay England, and Carol Breyer Fowler Gentry, designed fabrics for leading fabric firms. Another, Donna Sharp of Bullitt County, created a multi-million-dollar business. Kentucky's 21st century quilt bloggers and authors, among whom are Erin Harris and Kathy Loomis, both national followers of their blogs as well as their books. Two Kentucky sisters, Colleen and Maggie Kleins, lead the Onshall Project, in which women in India are earning their own income and escaping human trafficking by making quilts and fashionable garments sold in the United States. And quilt makers throughout the Commonwealth are donating their time and effort to creating quilts to donate to or to sell to raise money for charitable causes. As indicated earlier, the Kentucky quilt world is a realm rife with richly textured stories, dynamic personalities, powerful cutting-edge art, and entrepreneurial invention. And given the fact that the popularity of quilts and quilt studies is expanding exponentially every year, there will certainly always be more. Thank you.